You know sauerkraut, right. That sort of sour, crunchy stuff you sometimes get on a hot dog or sandwich. Well, it turns out that humble pile of fermented cabbage might actually be doing some pretty interesting things inside your body. Way more than just adding flavor.
That's exactly right. We've been diving into some really compelling new research. This one's from UC Davis.
Okay.
And it suggests sauerkraut could be, well, surprisingly valuable for supporting your gut health.
Right. We looked at an article on earth.com that really breaks down this study. And our mission here really is to give you the key insights.
Yeah, the shortcut.
Exactly. A shortcut to understanding how this, pretty common food might have more health perks than you think.
And it's interesting because while this specific science is new, fermented foods like sauerkraut, they're definitely not new.
No, centuries old.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cultures all over the world have been fermenting cabbage forever. You've got Suankai in China,
Yeah.
curtido in Latin America.
Right.
This isn't some quick health trend. It's a really time-tested thing.
Okay, so let's get into the weeds with this UC Davis study then. What exactly were they trying to figure out? What was the main question?
Well, fundamentally, they wanted to understand the chemical differences between just plain raw cabbage and sauerkraut after it's fermented.
Okay.
And then, crucially, how those differences impact our gut health, right down at the cellular level. They were really digging into what that fermentation actually does.
And how did they go about that? What did the experiment look like?
So they took a few things, raw cabbage, obviously. Then sauerkraut, they made themselves homemade style,
Mm-hmm.
and also the kind you just buy at the store.
Uh-huh.
And they even looked at the brine, the liquid left over.
Right. The juice.
Yeah. And to test the gut effects, they use these things called CACO2 cells. It's a standard lab model, basically mimics the lining of our human intestine.
Okay, like a gut in a dish kind of thing.
Sort of, yeah. And then they expose these cells to stuff that causes inflammation, basically simulating some gut stress to see how the cabbage and sauerkraut affected things.
So what jumped out? What were the big findings from all this?
Well, one of the really standout results was that sauerkraut didn't matter if it was homemade or store-bought. It helped protect that intestinal barrier model from the damage the inflammation was causing.
That's significant.
It is. And interestingly, the raw cabbage by itself, or even just the brine liquid, they didn't really offer that same protective effect.
Huh. So it's the fermentation that's key. I think Professor Marco even said something like, it doesn't matter in a way if we make sauerkraut at home or we buy it. Both kinds seem to protect gut function.
Exactly. Which is pretty reassuring, right, if you don't have time to ferment your own.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But maybe we should back up a sec. Why is this gut barrier so important anyway? Why should we care if it's protected?
Oh, it's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Think of your gut lining as like a super smart border control.
Okay.
It lets the good stuff in nutrients, but it's meant to keep the bad stuff out, like harmful microbes or toxins.
Right.
If that barrier gets weak or leaky, it can let things through that shouldn't be there, triggering inflammation. And that's linked to all sorts of issues, not just digestive ones like IBS, but potentially metabolic diseases too.
So keeping it strong is a pretty big deal for overall health then.
A very big deal.
Yeah. So how exactly did the sauerkraut help strengthen this barrier in their cell model? What were they measuring?
They looked at a couple of key things. One was called transepithelial electrical resistance, or T. High T basically means the cells are forming a nice, tight, strong barrier, like the connections are solid. Sauerkraut helped maintain that T, even under stress.
Gotcha.
And they also looked at something called paracellular permeability. That's basically a measure of leakiness between the cells.
Ah, so less leakage is better.
Exactly. And sauerkraut reduced that permeability, meaning fewer unwanted things could sneak through. And this protection, it was pretty consistent across the different sauerkrauts they tested.
It really sounds like the fermentation process is creating something special in there. What's behind that transformation? What's it producing?
A lot of it boils down to metabolites. These are small molecules that get produced during biological processes, especially when microbes break down food, like in fermentation.
Right.
And Professor Marco pointed out something really neat. There's a lot of overlap between the metabolites they found in the sauerkraut and the ones that a healthy gut microbiome naturally produces anyway.
Oh, interesting. So it's like giving your gut things it already recognizes.
That's a great way to put it. It really strengthens that connection, suggesting sauerkraut can kind of speak the same language as a healthy gut.
Are there specific compounds they identified that seem especially beneficial?
Yeah, they did pinpoint a few. Compared to the raw cabbage, the sauerkraut had much higher levels of things like diphenylactate, DPLA for short.
Okay.
and indole-3-lactate, or ILA, and of course lactic acid, which is kind of the hallmark of fermentation.
Lactic acid, right?
And what's cool is that our own good gut bacteria also make these compounds. They're known to help support our immune system. Yeah, keep the gut lining healthy. Some even have antioxidant effects.
So it's almost like this sauerkraut is providing pre-made beneficial signals or building blocks.
Precisely. It's quite fascinating.
What about probiotics? We hear so much about them. Did this specific bacteria play a role here?
They looked into that too. They made some lab-fermented sauerkraut using a specific probiotic strain, Lactobacillus plantarum, LP8826R.
Okay.
And they found its metabolite profile was actually pretty similar to the commercial stuff. It had more sugar alcohols like sorbitol and mannitol, and it was more acidic.
And that acidity is good.
Yeah, it helps preserve the sauerkraut, but it also helps create an environment where beneficial bacteria can thrive.
It sounds like it's not just one thing, but maybe the combination of everything in the sauerkraut.
That seems to be a really crucial takeaway here. They actually isolated some of those compounds we mentioned, the DPLA, ILA, lactate, and tested them on their own. And while those individual compounds did show some benefit, the whole sauerkraut, the complete package, was significantly more effective at protecting that gut barrier.
The whole food synergy idea.
Exactly. It really supports the notion that eating the whole fermented food is often better than just taking an isolated supplement. There's something about that complex mix working together.
Yeah.
Like Professor Marco said, a little bit of sauerkraut could go a long way. Suggesting, just incorporating it regularly could be beneficial. It's the whole fermented matrix.
That makes a lot of sense. So even though they found the sauerkraut didn't always lower one specific inflammation marker they tracked?
Right. They measured IL-8, which is a common inflammation signal. And yeah, sauerkraut didn't consistently knock that down in all tests.
But it still protected the barrier.
But it still protected the barrier significantly.
Yeah.
Which suggests it might be working differently. Maybe less about directly blocking the inflammatory signal and more about strengthening the barrier itself so it's less vulnerable to damage in the first place.
That's a subtle but really interesting difference in mechanism.
It is, yeah. Preventing the damage versus just calming the alarm bells after the damage is done, perhaps.
Did they find anything else about how it works on a more, fundamental level?
Yeah.
Genes, maybe?
They did touch on gene expression. They found that the lab batches made with that L. plantarum strain actually helped bring levels of a gene called MLCK back towards normal.
MLCK, what does that do?
Myosin light chain kinase. It plays a really important role in regulating the tight junctions, those connections between the gut cells we talked about.
So it helps keep the wall strong at a genetic level, too.
It seems that way, yes, helping maintain the integrity of those junctions.
Now, you mentioned store-bought sauerkraut. The article noted something about compounds related to storage, putrescine and tyramine.
Yeah, that's right. They found higher levels of those in the commercial samples. These are compounds that can sometimes build up as food is stored over time.
Are they bad?
Well, in this particular study, they didn't seem to cause any harm or negate the protective effects. But it's just a point that, how sauerkraut is stored commercially can influence its final chemical makeup. Something to be aware of.
Okay. This all sounds incredibly positive, but we need to remember this was all done with cells in a lab, right? Not actual people eating the sauerkraut.
That is the crucial caveat, absolutely. These cell-based studies, they're fantastic for giving us initial evidence, really strong clues about what might be happening.
But not the final word.
Not the final word. The next essential step is human clinical trials. We need to see if these protective effects actually translate to the incredibly complex environment of a living human gut.
Right, there's so much more going on in there.
Exactly. We need to figure out things like, how long do these beneficial compounds stick around? How much sauerkraut do you actually need to eat to get an effect? And how does it interact with the trillions of microbes already living in our gut? That's a huge question.
So, more research needed, as always.
As always in science, yes.
But even with that need for more research, the overall takeaway from this UC Davis study seems pretty promising, wouldn't you say?
I'd say so, yes. Despite needing those human trials, it provides really compelling initial evidence that fermented cabbage, sauerkraut, consistently helps protect intestinal cells.
Yeah.
And the fact that this benefit seems pretty consistent, whether it's homemade or store-bought, that makes it potentially a very accessible, very practical way for people to maybe support their gut health.
So for everyone listening, the key point really is Sauerkraut, the simple everyday food, shows some serious scientific potential for helping your gut health, mainly by protecting that vital intestinal barrier.
Hmm.
It's kind of shifting the view from just taste to actual potential biological benefits backed by research.
Absolutely. It prompts you to think about sauerkraut a bit differently. It's not just a condiment anymore. It's a food with potentially some real functional benefits.
It really does make you look at that forkful of sauerkraut differently, doesn't it? Maybe it's not just a topping, but something to add in more regularly for your inner ecosystem, so to speak.
And that leads to a broader thought, doesn't it?
Mm,
If sauerkraut, this ancient traditional food, has these potential benefits, science is just uncovering.
yeah. What else is out there?
Exactly. What other long-standing traditional foods, maybe other fermented things from around the world, might hold surprising health secrets that we're only just beginning to explore scientifically? It really makes you wonder about the wisdom embedded in some of these age-old food practices.